Federal Court, early October morning. The air in the courtroom was unusually thick, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something monumental to unfold. The public seating was packed. Reporters sat silently with notebooks open, fingers poised over their keyboards. Outside, a film crew from a nation's largest news network stood ready. This wasn't just another contract dispute. It was a battle between a lone individual and a corporate giant. At the plaintiff's table, Karoline Leavitt, a young attorney with an unsettlingly calm demeanor, flipped through the case files on the table. Her sharp brown eyes scanned every word, as if imprinting each detail into memory. Today, she wasn't just representing her client. She was standing against one of the most powerful energy corporations in the country, PowerX Corporation. Across the courtroom, Jacob Sterling sat with one leg crossed over the other, exuding confidence. His silver-streaked hair and perfectly tailored black suit gave him the air of a man who had won more battles outside the courtroom than within. Sterling wasn't just a lawyer. He fought with power, influence, and the dark secrets he held. Ms. Leavitt, Sterling's voice broke the silence, deep and resonant. I almost thought you wouldn't show up. You know, some battles just aren't worth fighting. The courtroom fell still. Every gaze turned to Karoline, waiting for her response. But she simply smiled, a cold, knowing smile. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. She had an ace up her sleeve. Mr. Sterling, Karoline set the file down, her voice smooth yet razor-sharp. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting. A few people in the room chuckled, not quite mockingly, but not entirely convinced either. They didn't believe she could win. Why? Because she was up against PowerX, a corporation that had crushed opposition in dozens of lawsuits, twisting facts, bending the law, and silencing anyone who dared to challenge them. PowerX didn't lose, and they certainly didn't lose to an up-and-coming young attorney. Sterling leaned forward, lacing his fingers together, his smirk unwavering. You really think you can take down PowerX with a few legal arguments? This isn't law school, Ms. Leavitt. This is the real world. Karoline didn't answer right away. She met his gaze, staring deep, as if reading every calculation running through his mind. Then, slowly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded cream-colored document. The real world, you say? She unfolded the paper, her voice deliberate, every word carrying weight. Then tell me, Mr. Sterling, how do you plan to explain the evidence I'm about to present to the court? A ripple of shock spread through the room. Sterling blinked, just once, but Karoline caught it. The flicker of unease. He sensed danger. Judge Chambers leaned forward, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Ms. Leavitt, proceed. I'd very much like to see what your real world looks like. A deathly silence filled the courtroom as Karoline stepped toward the podium. Today, she wasn't just fighting for a client. She was fighting for justice. And by the time this trial was over, no one would ever underestimate Karoline Leavitt again. Was that intense enough for you? This is just the beginning of a legal showdown filled with twists and high-stakes confrontations. If you love gripping stories, thrilling legal battles, and powerful lessons on justice and resilience, hit that subscribe button for Golden Story. Golden Story brings you the most compelling narratives, where every word can change a destiny, and every decision can turn the tide. Are you ready to step into a world of relentless battles and unforgettable victories? Subscribe now so you don't miss a single story. Chapter 1. A new challenge for Karoline Leavitt. Federal Court of New York, a gloomy autumn morning. Lonely rays of sunlight pierced through the thick glass windows, casting a pale glow over the dark wooden benches. The air in the courtroom felt suffocating, as if it carried the weight of the world itself. Inside, no one dared to speak too loudly. Every breath, every glance, every small movement was measured with precision. This wasn't just a trial. This was a war. At the plaintiff's table, David Langley sat upright, his posture firm, but for those who looked closely, his knuckles were white from gripping the edge of his chair. He was not a man easily shaken. A lifetime in the energy industry had forged his unyielding spirit. But today, a flicker of worry clouded his gaze. He knew exactly what he was up against. Langley had once been a senior executive at PowerX, one of the most powerful energy corporations in the country. He wasn't fired for incompetence. He was eliminated for telling the truth. Just days after filing an internal report exposing severe financial and environmental violations, he was summoned to the chairman's office. His contract was terminated on the spot. No warning. No chance to defend himself. The official reason PowerX gave? Violation of confidentiality agreement. A vague accusation, yet legally airtight. By framing Langley as a whistleblower who had leaked internal information, PowerX turned him from a respected executive into a traitor overnight. And now, they were in court with a formidable legal team, ready to crush anyone daring enough to challenge their authority. On the other side of the courtroom, the defendant, PowerX Corporation, sat quietly, like a predator lying in wait. Representing them was Jacob Sterling, the corporation's chief legal counsel, a man whose face looked as if it had been carved from cold stone. With slick-back silver hair and an impeccably tailored suit, Sterling didn't need to speak to command the room. He had defended dozens of corporations in high-stakes lawsuits like this, and he had never lost. Langley knew this. Karoline Leavitt knew this. But this time, something was different. PowerX wasn't facing an opponent who would fold under pressure. They were facing Karoline Leavitt. As Langley's attorney, Karoline understood that she wasn't just fighting a corporation. She was fighting an entire system designed to shield the rich and powerful. PowerX had limitless financial resources, the best lawyers money could buy, and deep ties with industry elites. They never lost. But today, they weren't going up against just anyone. Today, PowerX was up against a lawyer who wasn't afraid. A lawyer who had mapped out every move in advance. A lawyer who knew that justice didn't come from power, it came from truth. And she was ready to do whatever it took to dismantle the empire PowerX had built on deception. The judge's gavel struck. The trial had begun. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward Karoline. She took a deep breath, unfazed by the scornful stares from the opposing counsel, then lifted her briefcase, preparing for the biggest battle of her career. The courtroom fell into a chilling silence as Karoline Leavitt stepped up to the plaintiff's table. She stood tall, shoulders squared, her gaze cold and calculating as it swept across the room. If anyone expected her to reveal even the slightest hint of nerves, they were mistaken. Every step she took was deliberate, steady. Across from her, Jacob Sterling leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of effortless confidence. His lips curled into a knowing smirk, as if he were watching a rookie step onto a battlefield meant for veterans. You again? Sterling's voice was deep, laced with mockery. I just hope you don't turn this courtroom into a law school lecture. A few chuckles rippled through the audience, as if they were witnessing a fight with an already decided outcome. Sterling wasn't just a good lawyer. He was a tactician. His entire career had been built on legal battles where he never lost. Not because he sought justice, because he wielded power. And today, he saw no reason why that would change. PowerX had come prepared. They had Langley's signed confidentiality agreement. They had airtight clauses rendering all of his claims legally void. They had a powerhouse legal team with over a century of combined experience. And they had Judge Eleanor Chambers, a notoriously strict and by-the-book jurist. Chambers wasn't the kind of judge who could be swayed easily. She was a woman of the law, not emotion. She respected contracts and had a history of ruling in favor of large corporations, not out of bias, but because the law allowed it. She studied Karoline, her sharp gaze assessing whether this young lawyer was worth her time. Everything was stacked against Karoline. But there was one thing PowerX and Sterling had overlooked. Karoline Leavitt never played by their rules. She had no corporate backing, no deep political connections, but she had the truth. And she knew that if the truth was presented correctly, even the toughest judges couldn't ignore it. Sterling adjusted his cufflinks, preparing to dismantle her case before it even began. But as Karoline slowly unlatched her briefcase, her eyes remained cold, unwavering. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm but cutting. Before we discuss the confidentiality agreement, I believe it would be useful to examine some evidence regarding how PowerX has deliberately manipulated the truth. A smirk flickered across Sterling's lips. He was expecting a performance. What he didn't know was that today wouldn't be a performance. Today was the beginning of PowerX's downfall. Do you think Karoline can turn the tide? Hit subscribe to Golden Story and stay tuned for the next gripping chapter. Golden Story delivers the most thrilling narratives, where every word can change a destiny and every decision can shift the game. Are you ready to step into a world of high-stakes legal battles and unexpected twists? Subscribe now so you don't miss a single story. Chapter 2. The Battle of Wits. Judge Chambers struck the gavel against the bench, signaling the start of the trial. The air in the courtroom thickened instantly, tense like a taut wire about to snap. Jacob Sterling rose from his chair. He wasn't in a hurry. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, like a man who had complete control over the room. He strode toward the podium and paused, letting his gaze sweep across the courtroom like a stage actor waiting for his audience's full attention. Then he began. Your Honor, the most important thing in this trial is not personal emotions. It's the truth. His voice was deep, smooth, each word carrying a weight that made it impossible not to listen. And the truth is, David Langley betrayed the company he once served. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Some raised their brows. A few reporters began scribbling furiously, their pens gliding across the pages as if they had just caught the scent of scandal. Sterling continued, his gaze locked onto Judge Chambers as though he were speaking to her alone. PowerX is not a perfect corporation. No one is. But there's one thing we have always upheld: employee loyalty and internal confidentiality. He paused, letting the silence settle before delivering his next line with deliberate regret. Unfortunately, Mr. Langley violated that principle. We have irrefutable evidence that he provided sensitive information to the press, causing millions of dollars in damages to the company. Like a magician unveiling his grand finale, Sterling turned back to his table, lifted a thick file, and placed it calmly on the desk. And here is the proof. A devastating blow. Sterling opened the file and pulled out a printed email. Crisp white paper with bold black letters, each word screaming betrayal. This is an email Mr. Langley sent to a journalist at the New York Tribune, just 3 days before he was terminated. He held the document high, ensuring the entire courtroom could see it. In it, he disclosed critical internal information, including unpublished financial data and sensitive details about our investment projects. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Karoline remained still, but she could feel the shift in the room. Some jurors were already glancing at Langley with suspicion. Judge Chambers, always stern, now seemed even colder, her gaze sharp as a blade as she scanned Langley. Sterling knew he had the room in his grip, and he didn't waste the moment. Your Honor, this is no longer just a dispute between a man and his former employer. This is a blatant act of betrayal, with real damages, real consequences. Then, for the first time in the trial, he turned directly to Karoline. And I look forward to hearing Ms. Leavitt's explanation for her client's actions. Because if we truly care about justice, we should start with the truth. A deafening silence filled the courtroom. Outside, reporters typed frantically, likely already drafting their headlines. David Langley scandal. PowerX unveils irrefutable evidence. Karoline could feel Langley's unease beside her. This was PowerX's strategy. They weren't here to argue. They were here to plan doubt. And if she didn't act now, this trial would be over before it even began. Karoline's counterattack, when the truth flips the game. No one in the courtroom dared to breathe. The shadow of PowerX loomed heavy, like a storm ready to crush anyone who stood against it. At the plaintiff's table, David Langley gripped the armrest of his chair, his face tense like a coiled spring. He had been in court before, but never like this. Never in a situation where his entire career, his entire life, rested in the hands of one person, Karoline Leavitt. But Karoline showed no signs of worry. She stood calmly, buttoned her blazer, and walked toward the podium. No rush, no panic. She looked at Sterling, The man who had just played what he believed was his winning hand. Then she spoke. "Mr. Sterling." Karoline tilted her head slightly, her voice measured, steady. "The email you just presented. It was retrieved from PowerX's internal system, correct?" Sterling leaned back, exuding the same air of confidence as before. "Of course," he said, his smirk widening. "All company data is securely stored within our system. These records are entirely legitimate." Karoline's lips curved into a faint smile, as if she had been waiting for this exact response. "Good." She turned to her table, opened her briefcase, and pulled out a thin, precise-looking document. "Because I have another question for you." Sterling's smirk faltered, but he maintained his composure. Karoline held up the document, making sure the entire courtroom could see. "In this folder is a forensic analysis of the email you just submitted." A few murmurs broke out. Some reporters exchanged confused glances, while others started scribbling faster. Sterling's smile disappeared completely. "We had an independent digital forensics expert examine this email," Karoline continued, her voice still calm, as if she were merely reporting facts. "And what we found might make PowerX rethink its legal strategy." She locked eyes with Sterling. Then she opened the folder, flipped through a few pages, and dropped the bombshell. "The metadata of this email has been altered." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, the rustling of papers. PowerX's shareholders, seated in the back row, shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned in, whispering furiously among themselves. Karoline pressed on. "Our analysis shows that the original email contained no confidential information. In fact, the original content was nothing more than a casual conversation, one that had nothing to do with financials or trade secrets." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. Judge Chambers sat upright, her hands folded beneath her chin, studying Sterling with the sharp gaze of a hawk. "Mr. Sterling," her voice was colder than steel, "if what Ms. Leavitt is saying is true, are you telling me that your corporation knowingly submitted falsified evidence?" Boom! Sterling froze for half a second. He didn't blink, but the confidence in his eyes wavered. For the first time in this trial, he was on the defensive. The murmurs behind him grew louder. A man in a gray suit, one of PowerX's major shareholders, leaned forward, his frown deepening as he eyed Sterling with growing displeasure. And Sterling knew it. Slowly, he turned back to his table, adjusting his tie, trying to regain his composure. But Karoline had seen the crack. She had struck his weak spot. She had taken control of the courtroom. PowerX thought they could manufacture the perfect lie. But they forgot one thing. The truth has a way of revealing itself. And today, the truth belonged to Karoline Leavitt. What will Sterling do to salvage the situation? Does PowerX have an escape plan? Hit subscribe to Golden Story now so you don't miss the next explosive chapter. Chapter 3. The climax, Karoline's victory. The opponent tries to regain control, but the truth is no longer theirs. Jacob Sterling had never felt like this before. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who got cornered. His entire career had been built on cases where he held complete control, whether through the law or the powerful connections backing him. But this time, everything was slipping through his fingers. He could feel the weight of the stairs behind him, the cold, calculating eyes of PowerX's shareholders, the people who had trusted him to win this case. If he lost, it wouldn't just be Langley's victory. It would be an unthinkable disaster for PowerX. He couldn't let that happen. Sterling took a deep breath, straightened his posture, smoothed down his suit jacket, and forced a smile. Though this time, it was a little strained. "Your Honor," his voice remained steady, but the sharpness was gone. "I acknowledge that there was an error in the email provided earlier. However," he paused, recalculating his strategy in mere seconds. "Even if this email was altered, it does not change the fact that Mr. Langley violated his confidentiality agreement." A few members of the audience frowned. Sterling noticed, but he pressed forward. Because the real issue here is not just the content of an email. It's the fact that Mr. Langley met with a journalist and discussed internal company matters. And as we all know, Your Honor, that alone is a clear breach of contract. A strategic pivot. He turned toward Karoline, his expression regaining confidence, as if he had just found a lifeline in the middle of the storm. But Karoline didn't react. No flicker of doubt, no trace of concern, only deadly calm. And that was when Sterling realized something truly dangerous. She had been waiting for this moment all along. Karoline gave a small nod, as if confirming to herself that everything was going exactly as planned. She walked to her table, opened her black leather briefcase, and retrieved a small silver USB drive. "Your Honor," her voice was soft, but every word carried undeniable weight. "If Mr. Sterling would like to discuss what truly happened in Mr. Langley's meetings with the press, then perhaps we should hear from PowerX directly." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Sterling froze. Karoline approached the judge's bench and placed the USB on the table in front of Judge Chambers. "This is an audio recording," she continued, her eyes locking on Sterling like a blade pressing against his throat, "of a conversation between Mr. Langley and none other than PowerX's CEO, Robert Ashford." A shockwave hit the courtroom. Judge Chambers narrowed her eyes, shifting her gaze from the USB to Karoline, then to Sterling, who no longer looked as composed as before. "The contents of this recording," Karoline said, her voice unwavering, "will reveal the real reason Mr. Langley was terminated. It will show this court that PowerX is not the victim in this case. They're the architects of a fabricated truth designed to protect themselves." The room went silent. Judge Chambers leaned forward, her expression now ice-cold. "Play the recording." A court officer plugged the USB into the system. Seconds later, Robert Ashford's deep, gravelly voice filled the room. "David, don't you understand? This isn't about ethics or the law. This is about the company, about our interests. You have two choices. Either you keep your mouth shut and walk away with a generous severance package, or we make sure you never work in this industry again. We'll take care of the rest. You just need to disappear." Boom! The room exploded with whispers, gasps, and stunned reactions. PowerX's shareholders sat rigid, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others leaning in and murmuring urgently to one another. Sterling did not move. For the first time in the trial, he had nothing to say. Judge Chambers blinked once, just once, before exhaling slowly. She was not surprised. She was only making sure she had heard it correctly. After a long pause, she sighed, removed her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked straight at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," her voice was sharper than ever, "I have seen my fair share of dirty tactics in this courtroom, but this is one of the most blatant cases I've encountered." No one dared to breathe. Sterling could not respond. There were no words left that could save him. Judge Chambers raised her gavel. "I am ordering an official investigation into PowerX's misconduct, and I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. PowerX is hereby ordered to pay millions of dollars in damages to David Langley." The trial was over. Sterling pressed his hands against the table, his jaw locked tight as he struggled to contain the burning rage inside him. He hadn't just lost. He had been utterly destroyed. Karoline calmly closed her briefcase. She had done it. She hadn't just won the case. She had exposed one of the most powerful corporations in America. And from this day forward, no one would ever underestimate Karoline Leavitt again. PowerX has fallen. But is Karoline truly safe? We'll try to stop her next. Hit subscribe to Golden Story now so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter. Final chapter. The end. Karoline's well-deserved recognition. A spectacular victory from underestimated underdog to formidable attorney. The courtroom erupted. Whispers, gasps, and murmurs filled the air. No one could believe that a young attorney, without a big-name reputation, without powerful backing, had just taken down one of the most powerful corporations in America right in front of their eyes. Reporters rushed toward the plaintiff's table, cameras flashing, pens scribbling furiously as they tried to capture what felt like a moment of legal history. "Ms. Leavitt, how did you uncover the falsified email? When did you first suspect PowerX of fabricating evidence? Do you think this case will trigger a wave of investigations against PowerX?" Karoline didn't answer immediately. She took a deep breath, absorbing the intensity of the moment. The storm of questions didn't rattle her. This was why she never rushed, never let herself get caught up in the noise. Because true victory wasn't about celebration. It was about knowing she had changed the game. Across the courtroom, Jacob Sterling sat motionless, his head slightly bowed, his once impenetrable confidence shattered. He had lost. And not just this case. He had lost his reputation. Everyone had seen it. The helplessness, the unraveling, the crushing defeat at the hands of a young lawyer he had mocked. PowerX's shareholders looked at him with icy expressions. Some had already risen from their seats, silently walking away, distancing themselves from the wreckage. PowerX had lost, and they knew it. But for Karoline Leavitt, this was just the beginning. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp autumn wind brushed against her face. But she didn't feel the cold. She felt more alive than ever. The grand wooden doors closed behind her, the chaotic hum of the courtroom fading into a distant memory. But before she could take another step, a tall man in a sleek black suit appeared in front of her. "Ms. Leavitt." Karoline turned, her sharp gaze quickly scanning him. Silver-streaked hair, impeccable posture, a knowing smirk. He wasn't a journalist, not a witness, not another opponent. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "We're looking for the best attorneys to take on corporate giants. If you're interested, give me a call." Karoline glanced at the card. The name of the firm made her pause. One of the most elite legal teams in the country. A firm known for taking down the very institutions that thought they were untouchable. This wasn't just an offer. It was an invitation to a whole new battlefield. One where legal fights weren't just about justice, but about strategy, power, and politics. She considered it for a moment. Then she smiled. As Karoline walked away, she knew something had shifted. Not just for PowerX. Not just for Sterling. For her. She was no longer just a good lawyer. She was a name that carried weight. And after today, the entire legal world would remember it. As she neared the courthouse steps, a familiar voice called from behind. "Ms. Leavitt." She turned. Judge Chambers, the notoriously tough, no-nonsense judge, stood on the landing above, looking down at her with something Karoline had never seen before. Amusement. "If you keep making veteran attorneys look this foolish, we're going to have to start paying them more." A ripple of laughter spread through the lingering crowd. To the press, it was just a clever remark. But Karoline understood what it truly meant. Recognition. A judge who had doubted her. A judge who had initially leaned toward PowerX. Now saw her differently. Not as an outsider, but as a real contender in the world of high-stakes law. Karoline Leavitt was no longer just another lawyer. She had carved her name into the legal system. She didn't need to respond. She simply smirked, turned, and walked away. Because from now on, whenever she stepped into a courtroom, no one would ever underestimate Karoline Leavitt again. Karoline's journey is just beginning. Who will stand in her way next? Hit subscribe to Golden Story now to follow more high-stakes legal battles and thrilling victories.